Okay, well, I guess now's a better time than okay. All right, chat. Well, today I had somebody ask me, Dubby, I've got an attack unlocked on my warrior, and I just don't know where it fits. It's called Upheaval, and basically that is what's called. And there's basically two kind of attacks in this game. You've got on global cooldown attacks and off global cooldown attacks. So basically what an off global cooldown is going to be an attack that you can use instantly anytime that's not going to be affected by the global cooldown of the game. And what the global cooldown is let's say I'm attacking a mob here. So when I hit my startup 1, 2, 3 combo in the game, I'll hit 1 and you'll see that timer kind of running there. That is what's called the global cooldown. That basically limits you from not being able to just to spam all your buttons all at once constantly. And that's what's going to kind of dictate the pace of the game for you. And then so the attacks that are affected by that global cooldown counter, those are called global cooldowns. And then if you guys notice here, my attacks right here, these are attacks that aren't affected by the global cooldown. So those are called, in short term, you're going to hear these terms a lot. There's going to be GCDs, which is global cooldown, and OGCDs. Those are off global cooldowns. So when somebody asks me, hey, I've got this new ability called Upheaval, when do I use it? When should I use it? And that's a great question because it kind of delves into a whole new kind of level of game, and it increases your play quite a bit in what's called weaving. And in this game, weaving is basically known as you weaving, you know, and fitting in between those global cooldown when you've got that little bit of time in between your attacks to fit those attacks that aren't affected by the global cooldown in between those two attacks. So here's a good way to show you. So I'm starting my attack right now. I'm going to hit 1 to start up my 1, 2, 3. And while that timer is doing its thing, I'm going to fit that upheaval in between hitting my 1 and my second chain in my 1, 2, 3 combo. So I'm going to go 1 upheaval and then into my 2. That is essentially what is weaving in this game. A lot of DPS have a ton of off global cooldowns that you're going to learn the best way to weave in between those 1, 2, 3 global cooldowns, and that's how you're going to maximize the damage out of your class. So that's a single weave. There's also double weaving. So if you go, now give me 1 second, let my my upheaval here come off cooldown. So essentially what you're trying to do is fit 2 of those off global cooldowns in that little bit of time you have between your 2 button presses. So I'm going to go 1, 2. So what I did there is I hit my heavy swing into an upheaval, into an onslaught, which is my gap closer, into my 2. So that's essentially a double weave. You're fitting 2 off global cooldowns in between, which is essentially a double. So that's the best time to be working in your upheaval if you're trying to, you know, just stretch every ounce of DPS you can out of your job. And again, it's a lot more prevalent. It's a lot more important in DPS classes like Ninja, Dragoon. They have a ton more off global cooldowns you have to worry about. So that basically covers when to use your off global cooldowns as a tank. And you know, your other tanks, your Gunbreaker, your Dark Knight, they have a lot more off global cooldowns than your Warrior and your Paladin. Your Warrior and your Paladin are really, really good starter tanks. If you're looking to get, you know, started with the tanking class, maybe you've never done it before and you've got a little bit of that tank anxiety, I always recommend either Paladin or Warrior to start, just because they're the most straightforward. They have the least amount of off global cooldowns, and they're really, really good defensively in Endwalker right now. So if you look at something like Dark Knight, you've got a lot more off global cooldowns. So for example, I'm gonna go we'll go 1 into that, 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 into that. So you've got a lot more opportunity to fit like doubles, singles, that kind of thing. So Dark Knight and your Gunbreaker, you have a lot more of a high skill ceiling. You can do more damage as those 2 jobs, but you got to think too, you're managing a lot more in like an extreme fight or something. You've got to pay attention to where you're facing the boss, you know, what you know, where your base is, where your melee DPS is, to make sure they're getting their max uptime on their positionals, and you know, all that thing. So sometimes it can be a little bit much if you're just starting out tanking. That's why I always recommend Warrior, Paladin. Number 2, there are things called positionals in this game. So if you guys don't know what positionals are, your melee DPS essentially get added damage to a boss if they are hitting it from a specific position. So if you look at this target right here, if you see the big arrow facing you right here, that means you are standing directly at either the boss or whatever mob you're targeting. They're facing you directly. Now, the flank is going to be right here. It's these two signs right here, and there are some classes that get added damage from attacking from the flank. And then the big break in the circle behind it, that is the rear. And they also get damage bonuses from that as well. So when you're fighting a boss and you're trying to see, okay, where is my melee DPS? Like, let's say we had a melee DPS like right here for you, right? If something happened, you know, then maybe there's a spread mechanic where everybody had to stack up, then spread, and he's just kind of sitting here wailing away on your boss, right? So what you want to do as a tank, just so you know, as long as it's not gonna, you know, you're not gonna turn the boss and like turn and burn your entire group or something. Let's say it's like a dungeon, nothing really too serious. A good thing to do is to hit your mob, and then you're gonna just steer it over here. And typically, you know, the mob will follow you. Then that arrow will be facing this way, and the position will be available for your DPS to get max uptime and max damage on it. So that is essentially what are called positionals. Very, very important as for tanks to know. You got to be very, very aware. You always want to make sure that this is facing you. And when you are facing a boss, make sure that this circle behind it, and sometimes it's a little hard to see with like bigger mobs and stuff, but you always want to make sure that that break in your in the circle in the mob is facing towards your group. That means the backside is facing towards your group. That way, you know, a lot of bosses have like cleave mechanics, they have frontal cone mechanics. That way the only person who's going to be getting hit by those frontal cones is going to be you, to run out of the way, and that way everybody behind the boss doesn't really have to worry about it. Okay, that is positionals. Very, very important as a tank player. Remember, keep those in mind. You want to work on your weaving and also your tank positionals. Those are probably the two things I'd say. Try just to start working into your gameplay slowly. If you're going to start working on weaving, try to work on just getting those single weaves in. And if you're working on your positionals, just always try to be aware of where your flanks are at, where's the back of the boss facing, just so you know your ninjas and your dragoons won't cry when they can't get maximum uptime or something like that. And, oh god, this tank's terrible. Just keep on it, man. And don't be afraid to move the boss. But a good rule of thumb too for tanking with your positionals is just don't move. Don't move. Let your DPS kind of scatter around and find where they want to camp and do their max DPS. But once you've got a good place for your boss, unless the mechanics call for it for you to move, try to stay as still as you possibly can. Okay, and that'll basically cover you know, your positionals and your weaving. Third thing, people a lot always ask me, you know, I have a hard time kind of getting two mobs kind of grouped together effectively when I'm doing a wall, or I'm attempting to do a wall-to-wall pull. Like, how do you do it effectively? And this is how I always approached it, and this is what's always personally worked best for me. You know, find something that's comfortable for you, but in essence, it's all kind of the same. So let's say, again, we've got our two mobs here. And what I typically always like to do, let's say, okay, dungeon starts, or you know, whatever starts, and we gotta clear out some trash. You're gonna be running, you're running. I always target the furthest mob, and then I'll use my provoke, which is going to be my furthest ranged attack that you have as a tank. So you'll be running, and you'll taunt the furthest mob away from you, and that'll usually draw in this close mob and whatever two other mobs, maybe right here, maybe there's three, maybe there's only one. That way, by the time you've ran up and you've reached that furthest mob, everything's pretty much crowded around you for be able to do that AoE to get everybody's attention. Now, once you have done your first AoE, you always want to keep your enemy list pretty close near your character model. That way you can kind of glance over, because this little symbol here is very important as a tank, especially if you're doing dungeons. And so, you know, it basically tells you, this little list, that the enemy list, everything is going to be targeting you when it has this little orange circle next to it. So if you glance over, maybe you're trying to get everything rounded up, and you see like a blue star or like a yellow star or something, that means they're targeting either one of your DPS or your healers, which is bad. You obviously want everything on your so like if you come over here and I attack this one, as you can see there's another orange circle. You want it looking just like this. That way everything is targeting you. Everything's trying to do as much damage on you as possible, which is exactly how you want it. So again, let's run through that again. We're going to be running up. I'm going to be provoking the furthest thing in the first group, running up to it, AoEing, and then I'll typically get all of those mobs effectively in that one AoE. Once you've done that one AoE, you're going to sprint over, and you've got a second pack, let's say, because typically in a wall-to-wall pull, there's usually either 2 or 3 packs in between those wall-to-wall pulls. So as you're running to your next one, well, my provoke's on cooldown now. What am I going to use to pull it? Well, all tanks have a ranged attack, and I would recommend setting all those ranged attacks to the same keybind on all your tanks. That way it's the same for every single job. Hold on, this is horrible. There we go. Okay, so you target the furthest one away again. I'm going to run, use my Tomahawk, and then as they're grouping up, boom, hit them with another one. And you're pretty much gravy. Okay, now you've got 2 packs of mobs on you, right? You want to get them all grouped up. So one thing I like to do, like let's say if we've got some ranged mobs in them, you know, maybe they're not really coming to get, you know, AoE down by all your melee and your ranged and stuff like that. You've got a couple of stragglers who are like just sitting back there casting at you. One thing I like to do, and you always, you want to practice when you're starting to get really comfy with your tank. You want to kind of line of sight those mobs. So as you've gotten everything, all the melee, you know, mobs on you, try to run around something that's going to break the line of sight of those ranged mobs. That way they're forced to come and find a line of sight for you to start attacking you. That way, let's say I was hiding right here and the mobs were over there, they'd run and run and run until they were like right about here. And at that instance, I can either run back and attack them, and that way I've got everything grouped up in one convenient pack for my DPS just to burn it down. Or you can essentially just, you know, keep attacking your melee DPS, and that way they're not too far for you. Once all the melee's dead, you can just run over and manage them, or you can keep a close eye on them with your tomahawks and your taunts and that kind of thing. Okay, now you've got everything rounded up. Everything's attacking you. Everything's beating you senseless, right? What is your priorities for defensives, W? What do you use personally for doing wall-to-wall pulls or boss fights or anything like that? Well, it really varies. So for dungeons, when I'm just doing wall-to-wall pulls and just trying to get, you know, dungeons done as fast as I can, the main thing you want to focus on as a tank in dungeons is you want to be cycling your defensive cooldowns effectively. That way your healer isn't having to dump so much time into healing you, and they're more freed up to be able to do more DPS to burn everything down faster with your DPS. Because you're not taking any damage, you don't have to worry about damage reduction if everything's just dead. So this is typically what I personally use. Feel free to tweak it if you want to something that, you know, works better with your playstyle, or if it just fits better with how your brain works, you know, to each their own. But typically, if it's a fresh start and I'm running into a group, I will always use what's called minor defensives. So what a minor is, it's basically going to be anything that isn't going to just give you a straight up damage reduction as soon as you press that one button. So for me, I play warrior the most. That's my main tank. So for my 2 main minor, you know, defensive cooldowns, I'll use reprisal and arm's length. Arm's length has 2 effects to it. Most people think it's just used for the pushback. That's not true. It's also got an effect that when trash mobs attack you, they're slowed by 20%. So they're going to attack you 20% slower. And also your appraisal is going to be giving them 10% less damage reduction. So essentially, you stack those 2 together. That is a 30% damage reduction, which is huge. You know, that's a vengeance, essentially. Vengeance is, like, in my opinion, the best defensive cooldown in the game as far as warrior defensives go. I mean, tank defensives go. So those are very powerful. And I use those 2 because they've got the shortest cooldown for you to use in between your packs. And they're not going to punish you too hard if, like, your healer's, you know, face rolling on his keyboard, or he just smoked a big joint or something and he's just not really paying attention. So I'll usually run in, I'll do the far taunt, boom, run over, get my second group, boom. Once I've done those 2, all tanks, when you get, you know, your first kind of minor quick defensive cooldown, like warriors get raw intuition, paladins get Sheltron. I can't remember what Dark Knight, I think Dark Knight just gets Blackest Night at a certain point. And Gunbreaker also gets Heart of Stone, I believe is what it's called in the early levels. So you're going to get that ability, and all of them essentially have like a 20-second cooldown, if you will. And what they'll do is they'll grant you about like a 20% damage reduction for 4 seconds. And then with Warrior 2 Raw Intuition, every time you attack, you'll gain a portion of the attack that you did back as health leech. So if you look here, when I pop Bloodwetting and I'll use Infuriate, I'll attack, and I did 21k and I got a 9,000 heal back, which is huge because it also affects AoE. Ah, shit, I didn't get it off in time. But essentially, this attack that I did with my Overpower, how I did 1,700 and 2,700 to both these mobs, those are both going to translate into healing to you. So as a warrior, you want to round up as much as you can, make sure you hit that blood wedding and just start dumping beast gauge into doing as much AoE as you can, because that your health bar is not going to move while you have either blood wedding or raw intuition up. So you've got the first 3 down. Reprisal into arm's length into your quick recharge kind of defensive. And then after that is down, I'll typically glance over at my enemy list and see like where are we at health wise. If it's anything over, if all the mobs are typically over like 50 to 60%, I'll usually pop a second defensive, which will be like Rampart. Is usually always the one I go to. You might want to weave in like a Vengeance if you like hitting Vengeance more, to each their own. I like using Vengeance for you know, the kind of those bigger pulls or boss fights too, just because not only are you reducing 30% damage, it's hitting them back for 55 potency every time they hit you. So again, we'll go over that one more time. We're gonna be running, doing our taunt, getting these guys rounded up. Boom, hit him with the first AoE. You're gonna come over, target the furthest one, ranged. They're gonna target you, hit him with that second AoE. Okay. You've got all the melee pretty much on you. They're sitting here beating the shit out of you. Oh, you look back. Oh, there's a couple ranged. Oh, crap. Okay, what am I going to do? Boom. Line of sight them. That's going to force them to come up while your melee is still beating you up. They're going to come force around, and you can kind of keep an eye on them. As soon as they get into your line of sight, you can either use a quick gap closer like this and just get over to them and just start rounding everything up into one big pile, just AoEing them down. And then that's, you know, right when you start thinking, okay, what's going to be my first cooldowns? And that's when you're going, oh, sorry about that. That's when you're essentially going to start working in those bigger cooldowns like your Rampart, your Vengeance, and if need be, if your healer is really just not on the ball, keep a trigger finger on that invuln. All tanks have them, and they're really handy to have. So, yeah. Well, I hope that helped, guys. If it did, I hope you guys did enjoy. Leave a like if you'd like. And feel free to stop by my stream. I stream every day, mostly Final Fantasy, twitch.tv/JW, where I tank all kinds of content. So if you guys did enjoy, swing by, and I hope to see you. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.